Are tiny homes cost-effective for millennials in iGen? By Calvin Horton. A quintessential part of the American dream is owning a home. The American dream as defined by Vikram Mushurami, PBS, is a white picket fence around a private yard, 2 to 3 children in the home, and a nice car or two. The home in this imaginary perfect life is most likely a McMansion. McMansion is a phrase coined in the 1980s to describe homes built unnecessarily large and for very cheap. McMansions are affectionately named after the famous fast food chain McDonald's, who's famous for their large, unhealthy, cheap meals and are fueling the country's rising obesity rate. The housing market has essentially become obese because of these McMansions, and the square foot per household has doubled in the past 40 years. The rate of homeownership in the United States has fallen by over 10% between 2005 and 2015. The ever-rising cost of living, many members of the millennial generation are struggling to pay for necessities such as food and transportation to the jobs that cannot maintain their lifestyle. Because of this, homeownership has left the American dream in minds of younger generations. Millennials are entering the professional world and seeking alternative housing methods in order to avoid the towering debt caused by a long-term mortgage they've seen their parents struggle to pay year after year. Tiny homes are an effective way to allow younger generations, such as Millennials and Generation Z, to own a home and create financial stability as part of the American dream. Tiny homes not only offer the ability for financial stability for these younger generations, but they also avoid the growing issue of homelessness within the younger generations of America. About 1.5 million people aged from 20 to 25 do not own a home and do not believe confidently that they will own a home in the future. They simply cannot afford the upkeep and mortgage of a home. Their incomes are lower than a 20th of the average cost of a down payment on a typical home. According to research by Amelia Jofferson of Smart Asset, the average millennial made less than $40,000 a year, while the rent in America often requires a six-figure salary to maintain a healthy lifestyle and still afford a home to rent. If the average millennial saved about 20% of their salary every year, they'd be able to completely own a tiny home that costs $35,000 in about 4 to 5 years. After the initial purchase of the home, monthly upkeep would be a fraction of what it'd be to pay a normal rent in the United States. Many of the young people affected by the growing cost of homeownership still live with their parents or multiple roommates to try and supplement the cost of living, yet their spendings on daily outgoings are larger than the income of their generation. Even though many young people do not believe that they will realistically be able to own a home, it is still seen as a symbol of financial stability in the eyes of young Americans. It's becoming increasingly difficult to own a home, so the status of financial well-being is being held on an even higher level than before in younger generations. Many millennials don't even have $1,000 saved up towards their future. They're unable to save money because they're making significantly less money than older generations when inflation is adjusted. Tiny homes can often be built for less than $50,000 as opposed to the average cost of a home being $189,000, which requires the owner to take a large, steep mortgage that increases the cost of the home exponentially through interest. Tiny homes require a larger input cost than the average down payment on a home, but do not necessitate further payments over a 15 or 30-year period as you would with a financed home. Tiny homes are becoming a very appealing option to combat the housing issue in the United States of America. When many people think of tiny homes, they imagine living in a woodshed in their backyard with a tiny, uncomfortable bed. But many of these homes are built using superior materials to that of a typical home and are designed into beautiful, elegant living spaces for younger generations. Not all tiny homeowners run a business, but those who do run it out of their tiny home, and then that proves the functionality and utility of these tiny spaces. A McMansion is essentially the opposite of a tiny home. Tiny homes are small, and they're very well laid out, and each specific corner has its purpose. McMansions are the opposite. They're built just to maximize the size of the home, and not every bit of the home is being used, which leads to useless space, and they're usually built very cheaply and will fall apart. There are two types of tiny homes. There's tiny homes on foundations. They're usually built on the land owned by the homeowner, and they're hooked up to a septic tank or city water, and then they run electricity just as you would with a typical home. Then we have tiny homes on wheels, which are similar to an RV. They can hook up to water in a RV park, and they run electricity through a port on the side of the house, connected to a generator or connected to city power. Tiny homes on foundations are going to be less cost effective for the younger generations, as they take that $50,000 mark for the average tiny home and go a bit further, maybe reaching $75,000. This because you must own the piece of land you're building it on, and you must also build a foundation for which you can further build your tiny home. Tiny homes on wheels are typically more cost effective because they're built on a trailer as opposed to a foundation, and you don't necessarily have to own the land upon which you park your house. They can be taken to RV parks, private land. They can be driven on the road, and they must meet certain requirements as far as height so that they can safely travel on our interstates. These houses are typically parked in RV parks where there is a monthly rent, but it's much cheaper compared to that of a rent of a home in the United States. When you compare a tiny home and a traditional home on a per square foot basis, the tiny home is going to look significantly more expensive. If you're basing your purchase just on that, you should look at how much square foot you get and how much you actually use. The tiny homes only possess the amount of square foot that you're going to use, and each little bit is planned out to meet a specific utility. Your giant bedroom with enough room for a party isn't going to necessarily serve a purpose every single day. Tiny homes are going to be significantly cheaper compared to traditional homes, but there is a wide varying range of price within the tiny house market. The home on the right is going to be on the lower end of the market. It's not very desirable. It looks like a shed, and it's probably built just for utility and isn't meant to be any special piece. The one on the left, however, is going to be built by a designer. It's a tiny house builder called Tumbleweed, and they're famous for expensive, lavish tiny houses. Many of those who build tiny homes don't necessarily take into account the cost to run utilities to their home. Those built on foundations require a septic tank or city water or electricity run out, and many people don't consider that. Those on trailers need to take into account where they're going to park their house so that they can hook up to RV power, RV water, or whether they're going to run out a system on their own land, or whether they're going to run a solar system to try and run completely off the grid. Tiny homes typically cost around $50,000 initially, and then they cost maybe about $400 a month for daily upkeep. The average traditional home in America is around $400,000 to buy a McMansion that's typically of a lower quality than a tiny house. And then daily upkeep is going to be about twice that of a tiny home. Tiny homes are a viable option for both short-term and long-term housing for younger generations. The cost of owning a tiny home matches the reduced paychecks of younger generations, with about a $13,000 decrease in income from 1984 to 2009. These homes will provide savings for millennials and allow them a greater financial stability as they emerge within the professional world.